Hey everybody, it's so good to reconnect again from Parliament and what's been an incredibly busy week. So just a couple of highlights from at least the work that I've been engaged with, and then today I want to talk to you about the Fair Pay Bill, and then also, I guess the organizing question that we seem to be finding, is there a need for more political parties? And then I want to talk a little bit about that as it relates to the national dialogue. So let's begin. So just a couple of updates. I've been following Mamelodi Sundowns. They're doing relatively well, and I'm not even a Sundown supporter, but they support our country, and so I want to wish Sundowns well in their last group game in the FIFA Club World Cup. And let's see how they do, man. They're representing us. They're flying the flag. There are other teams like in Auckland who got hidings there, and Sundowns have stood the test of time. Soon, Kaizer Chiefs will be there, I'm sure, in my lifetime. Chiefs at the Club World Cup in my lifetime. Amandla. Anyways, on other issues, we've had a very busy week. Naturally, the budget process takes multiple stages. We went past the fiscal framework. This week, as importantly, we moved to the second phase of it, which is the division of revenue bill, which actually works through how the vertical allocation of money, so national, provincial, and municipalities. And so we'll talk about economic growth, we'll talk about how that goes and how we introduce gross capital formation. Ultimately, the question is, how are we creating jobs in South Africa? Where's the investment? How do we keep South Africans safe? Educate our country so that it can participate, young people can participate in the economy. Those are the key critical points I keep fighting for. And ultimately, we're also observing a whole lot of issues that are taking place geopolitically all over the world. And I still maintain that violence never begets more violence, and therefore some form of de-escalation and a sense upon which we can get back to ultimately ensuring that we live in a peaceful, safer world is much more important. So let's move on to what I think we've been having a fight about here in Parliament. And as Build One South Africa, we focused almost extensively on the Fair Pay Bill. Now, this is an important piece of legislation in that it amends the Employment Equity Act. So it acts as an amendment in this regard. And pieces of legislation such as this one or amendments of this one take multiplicity of processes. Private members' bills previously have faced their own challenges, but we can remember people like Mario Ambrosini, who I had the privilege of working or meeting towards the end of his tenure as a parliamentarian, won a very important battle of making sure that bills that came from the opposition were successful. We now live in a GNU world, and therefore this also, I believe that in the fact that there's no majoritarianism can be able to succeed. But what is this bill all about? Now, I have, previously, my first job, let me tell you, I worked for Total Sports. I worked as a casual. I used to sell shoes. I used to string rackets. I used to do a lot of things, and it was nice. But I was a casual. It means I'm a temporary worker. Then I proceeded, and I had a qualification, so I worked in a church, then I worked in a school, and then post that, then began to look for more formal employment. Fortunately, in my life, we set up consulting firms, we then did communication. There have been multiple other job opportunities going forward. But I think about a pathway for most young people in our country. They may follow a similar one to me. They start doing a piece job somewhere, they work in the social services, and then maybe, who knows, they end up in a corporate of some kind. And often when people are in the job market, there are many issues that at attending their interviews or at the inquiry phase are often at a back foot. Our economy is such that 2 out of 3 young people do not have work. Our economy is such that job opportunities are less, even for graduates. You find that many graduates find themselves at home. This is not to say that we shouldn't getting more graduates. It just simply means that often graduates, the probability of finding work if you're a graduate is higher than someone who's only got a matric. So you find for many graduates, they come and apply. And at first, because of a desperation of work, there's no adverts as to what the salary band is or what it does. And so when you arrive coming from that space, the employer interviews, and let's say you do extraordinarily well, what the Fair Pay Bill says, actually the employer at that point cannot then ask you to produce your historical payment data, or in fact, your payslip. The discriminator against asking someone for their payslip is that often what it eventually ends up doing is that the employer then benchmarks what you are going to earn on the basis of that history rather than often what the job is worth. In a country where there's been historical injustices of labor abuse of some form or another, or ultimately where the employer holds all the cards, I think there's a justice component to this issue. The second issue is about saying to someone who comes into a space of work that we're not determining the worth of the work on the basis of your history, but on what we've already been paying someone who was in the job. Often companies are trying to replace someone or find or grow in an area. So if they benchmark the job within a band, that's what the person who's coming into a space of work needs to be paid. Thirdly, what the bill seeks to produce, it says you have then got the opportunity to interview the people who have been working in a similar grade, just so that you can understand that you yourself, as someone who's applying, is being paid fairly and correctly. Now, these are important issues because sometimes you may find a woman who comes to apply, do the same job as a man, but then gets paid less. The reports are indicating that there's a significant proportion of women that are underpaid relative to their male counterparts. So we've got to fix for that. And the second issue is the fact that it is about sometimes you find someone who was within the same company, gets promoted to become partner in an accounting firm or whatever the thing is, but then to discover that their PA, who has been there maybe for a few decades, earns more than them, which doesn't benchmark their salary relative to the other partners who are also being there. So what we're saying is that let the job be, let's pay equal pay for doing the same job. And I think this is an important component of justice. Now, as legislators, of course, I've heard many arguments. Are you putting towards a more cumbersome way of hiring people? No, we're saying transparency. Transparency stops people from abusing anyone who comes to apply for a job. Just be transparent. The second issue is that people say to me, but it's so hard for people to find work. Why are you even adding another layer, another barrier? I am saying if you are advertising for a job, do so fairly, reward people fairly, and ultimately, yes, I agree that we must create more jobs, but the effort to create more jobs surely cannot nullify the principle of saying there should be just and equitable and fair remuneration when somebody finds a job. Because let me tell you something. For me, the biggest economic empowerment, if you want to use that term, I'd never gotten like some other sideline deal. The biggest economic empowerment was being able to get a job. Because when you are able to get a job in some ways, what happens to your income, especially for me as a black South African, your income often goes towards supporting other family members, etc. So when you benchmark me against where I come from, you limit what is consumer purchasing power or disposable income. And so we've got to make sure that actually just and equitable payment takes place. And these are fundamentally important things in a society such as ours. It's crucial that we achieve that. So where is it now? The law, the Fair Pay Bill, will be submitted to the State Law Advisor. It will then obviously go for public consultation, make your views heard. And then a portfolio committee will have to consider the bill, and then it will eventually get voted for in Parliament, in which instance I would urge that the parties that vote against, for argument's sake, must be able to tell South Africans why they believe in unfair pay practice. On what basis do you think people who must be paid less for doing exactly the same job as someone who was working there? That must be the argument they should be able to satisfy everybody else. So this is about justice, this is about equity, it's about inclusion, and it's about making sure that South Africans are remunerated equitably and fairly, and addressing of historical injustices. Massive opportunity. Let's make sure we get it right, and I'm challenging all MPs. Let's fight, especially for those who are outside the space of work or seeking work. Let's make it possible for them to be just and fairly rewarded. So, as I promised, do we need another party? I hear people are holding public dialogues, there's all sorts of things like that. Actually, I think that South Africa goes into a national dialogue. So we're going to have this national dialogue. People are saying 700 million. I can tell you from an appropriations committee point of view, I haven't seen a special appropriation for 700 million rand. So I don't actually think that we can afford to spend that much, or we'll be able to quickly, in a space of time that we're in, make a special appropriation for it. Set that aside for 1 second. The second issue is that South Africa is failing the governance test. Now, national dialogues all over the world occur on the back of the fact that there's been a conflict and a crisis that occurs. So if there's conflict, i.e. Rwanda post-genocide, there's a sense upon which the country needs to come together and think about what it wants to do going forward. If countries who have been through war, Germany, many others, eventually after the war, post a massive conflict, sit back and go, how do we rebuild going forward? South Africa hasn't undergone. We had in 1994, post-apartheid, a massive national dialogue. Others would call it, all the dialogues that we took place during that time were about us setting up a future. The CODESA discussions and many others were about, this is the country that we'd like to see. But it occurs after ending apartheid in the beginning. What national dialogues are not servicing of are when a party loses an election. Because when a party loses an election and then you introduce a national dialogue, you end up in some ways what could happen in Zimbabwe, where when the liberation movement lost power, they created a government of national unity, is what they called it, and ultimately it perpetuates the idea that a liberation movement cannot lose power, be replaced, so that we can govern going forward. The test for South Africa is a governance test. Therefore, there must be a number of inbuilt assumptions into the national dialogue. The inbuilt assumption is that the constitution remains supreme. The inbuilt assumption is that actually we're here to discuss how do we capacitate governance better. The actual national dialogue is what role and what contribution should people put on the table. And whatever that comes in must always land at the feet of a government who is competent and committed to taking those actions forward. So it cannot be an event in some ways. Others have said it's a process, but that process must be guided. So here's my key suggestion. Why can't we think about a conversation amongst parties who share common values coming together? Now, here's a question. Let's say you're an ANC person and parties who have split off from the ANC, EFF, MK. What if they had a dialogue and thought about what it means in their ideological phrase to govern in that way? What if parties that say the central ground began to think about how we work together? Because the debate must always be, how do we, after the last 31 years of ANC government and still continuing, are there other models we can put on the table that means South Africa could be governed differently? Now, parties who may think South Africa must be governed differently must have a conversation and work together, because the ultimate national dialogue is when all of us go to the polls and say we choose this way of governing South Africa or that way of governing South Africa. So for me, yes, we will be participating in the national dialogue. Send me your input. We can make submissions. But please don't lose track of this idea of saying let's bring parties who agree to put forward an alternative for South Africa. Not more parties, not 100 more parties. That's not helpful. Let's narrow it down, consolidate, bring on more ideas into one tent. And yes, you're not going to get everything you like in one space, but there must be an ideological difference in choice. It's why if you went to the UK, you'd find Conservatives versus Labour. These express different ways of how the country can be governed, and therefore when voters go choose, they choose. If you went to the US, you get Republicans and Democrats. Yes, these are binary choices, and others would say, but maybe there are some similarities, but you know that your vote holds the one accountable for their previous mistakes or not. At this point in time, 70% of the country is governed by the GNU and 30% is in opposition. I want a space where we can have accountability so that we can choose one way or another. And I'm asking that parties who agree on one other way get together and make an important choice coming to an election. Because when that happens, your vote will mean both a repudiation of what's happened if you feel it's not been right, or a reward for what's happened if you feel it has been good. But also, it means you can put a referendum on the future. You can say, I'm betting on a different future in South Africa. South Africa will not prosper until it is governed differently. Doing more of the same isn't going to achieve the outcomes. And when we started Build One South Africa, we wanted to work with South Africans who share common values, common vision, to say, let's bring about the change that we need. And that's the journey, that's the discussion. And I'd rather be invested in that so that we can figure out how we govern differently for the future. I wish you well. It is freezing all over the country, and really do also send my deep condolences to all those who passed away in the Eastern Cape. It is hard and it is painful. And when all of these budget votes took place, the one item that was taken was the infrastructure rebuild fund, or some of the contingency reserve, and it has its own consequences when natural disasters occur. So I'm sending much love to the people of the Eastern Cape. Ndiyanithanda nonke and ndiyanithandazela. Ndawuthemba uThixo uzaba nani kweli xesha. Nkosi mayisibusise. Ayamure nabo lokhu esitshaba sayo. God bless you and much love.